You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your request for topics in the comments below. Back in 1805, James Wilkinson, the governor of Louisiana, described the Comanche as the most powerful nation of savages on this continent. They ruled over a vast area of the Great Plains, spanning 200,000 square miles, with their wealth largely coming from their extensive herds of horses. The Comanche depended on the abundant bison herds for their basic needs, but faced a significant setback when a smallpox epidemic drastically reduced their numbers around 1780 to 1781. Despite repeated outbreaks of smallpox and other European diseases, their population managed to stay strong, hovering around 20,000, thanks in part to the addition of captives who were adopted into the tribe. By 1823, records from the Mexican government showed that the Eastern Comanche tribe included 2,500 captives, excluding those who had joined the tribe voluntarily, with an estimate in the early 1830s of 500 to 600 individuals, not including Native Americans taken as slaves. In 1790, the Comanche tribe expanded their alliances by welcoming 2,000 Kiowa and Kiowa Apache into their fold, strengthening their presence in Comancheria. They maintained a cautious relationship with the Spanish through a combination of peaceful interactions and gifts, despite the French exiting the region in 1803 after selling Louisiana to the U.S. The Comanche found both opportunity and threat from the Anglo-Americans settling near Comancheria. The Spanish, compared to the rapidly growing American population, were limited in number, with New Mexico home to about 25,000 Spanish and Puebloans by 1800, and Texas having a Spanish population of around 5,000. In contrast, the United States population had reached 10 million by 1820, with many Anglo-Americans moving into Texas. This demographic shift opened up a significant market for Comanche horses and mules, starting with traders like the Irish-born Philip Nolan in the 1790s. However, their peaceful relations with the Spanish began to strain, especially in Texas after 1795 and more so once the Mexican War of Independence kicked off in 1810. Yet trade persisted. Following independence, Mexico, now strapped for resources, ceased the tributes to the Comanche, but in 1822 sought to mitigate the threat by inviting Comanche leaders to Mexico City to sign a treaty granting them major trading privileges. To bolster the Texas settlement's safety, Mexico opened Texas to foreign settlers in 1824, leading to a surge of Anglo-Americans who had already been trading with the Comanche moving in. Mexican concerns about their grip on the region proved valid as in 1825, 330 Comanche boldly entered and stayed in San Antonio, Texas's capital and largest city, for 6 days without opposition, and in 1832, 500 Comanche took control of the city again, facing no resistance from Mexican forces. This display of power and the evident weakness of Mexican Texas eventually led the Anglos to claim Texas's independence from Mexico in 1836. By the time Texas won its independence in 1836, a huge wave of Anglo settlers had significantly changed the region's demographic landscape. Initially, the area was home to fewer than 5,000 Spaniards in the early 19th century. However, by 1836, the population had surged to 38,000, including both Spanish and Anglo settlers, while the Native American population, Comanche included, was around 14,000, which might actually have been an underestimation. The Native American communities were further weakened by a devastating smallpox outbreak in the late 1830s. Despite these challenges, the Comanche tribe found strength and unity in 1840 by forming an alliance with the southern branches of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, putting an end to ongoing conflict and gaining around 2,000 new allies. As part of the peace agreement, the Comanche generously shared their resources, giving about 5 horses to each of the Cheyenne and Arapaho people who joined them. The newly established Republic of Texas, however, faced immediate tensions with the Comanche. A tragic event in May 1836 saw Comanche and Kiowa warriors attack Fort Parker, located 100 miles south of Dallas, killing 5 men and taking 5 women and children captive. Among those captured was a 9-year-old girl named Cynthia Ann Parker, who would later marry Comanche chief Peta Nocona and give birth to Quanah Parker, a prominent figure who would become the last war chief of the Comanche in the 1870s. The Comanche society's openness and drive for expansion made it easier for captives like Cynthia Ann Parker to be assimilated into the tribe. Efforts to establish peace between the Comanche and the Texas settlers were mixed. Sam Houston, the first president of Texas, aimed to negotiate a clear boundary between the settlers and Comanche territory. His successor, Mirabeau B. Lamar, took a more confrontational approach. A significant breakdown in relations occurred in 1840 when a peace delegation from the Comanche was attacked by Texas soldiers in San Antonio during a dispute over captives, resulting in the death of 35 Comanche, many of whom were leaders. This led to the Comanche, under Chief Buffalo Hump, launching a major retaliatory raid known as the Great Raid of 1840, targeting the towns of Victoria and Linville and causing significant destruction. The Texas militia eventually countered by ambushing the Comanche during their retreat in the Battle of Plum Creek near Lockhart, Texas, reclaiming some stolen goods and inflicting casualties on the Comanche. Later that year, a Texas militia attack on a Comanche village resulted in the death of 140 individuals, including women and children. These conflicts took a heavy toll financially on the Republic of Texas and led both sides to seek peace. The treaty was ratified in December 1845, establishing a trade line that also acted as a border between Texas and Comanche territory. In exchange for agreeing to halt raids in Texas, the Comanche were promised gifts and trading benefits with the Texans. After 1840, the Comanches shifted their focus in Texas towards a more defensive strategy, choosing instead to look for wealth south of the U.S. border in Mexico. They first raided past the Rio Grande in 1779, targeting the Lipan Apache. By the 1820s, Mexico, having just gained independence and thus weakened, struggled to defend its northern regions or continue the annual payments the Comanches had come to expect. In response to growing threats, in 1826, the Nuevo León government required that citizens in the state's northern areas travel only in groups of at least 30 armed and mounted men for safety. Large-scale raids by the Comanches, alongside their allies, including the Kiowa and other tribes, kicked off in 1840 and didn't halt until 1870. These raids stretched hundreds of miles south of the U.S. border, resulting in thousands of deaths and the theft of hundreds of thousands of livestock, much of which was sold to Anglo-Americans in the U.S. In 1848, traveler Josiah Gregg observed, "The whole country from New Mexico to the borders of Durango is almost entirely depopulated. The haciendas and ranchos have been mostly abandoned, and the people chiefly confined to the towns and cities." The northern Mexican states, with only their soldiers and militia to rely on, were left to fend off the Comanche raids on their own. The national government of Mexico, crippled by financial woes, civil war, and eventually foreign intervention, couldn't offer them any help. In 1845, after incorporating Texas into the United States, the government aimed to establish a new relationship with the Comanche and other local tribes along the upper Brazos River by signing what's known as the Butler-Lewis Treaty in May 1846. This agreement, involving several tribes including the Pennateca Comanche, was meant to bring peace and included promises of trading posts, a special visit to Washington, D.C., and a one-off $18,000 worth of goods. Though the treaty implied a clear boundary between Comanche lands and Texas, it wasn't specified, leaving room for future disputes. Not long after signing, a Comanche delegation met with President James K. Polk, but their treaty was left in limbo, as Congress was preoccupied with the outbreak of the Mexican War and failed to ratify it. It led the Comanches to feel betrayed until a revised version was reluctantly accepted in 1847, after certain confrontations and the promise of additional compensation. Still, a solid boundary was never established. This period also saw confusion over whether the Texas tribes were under federal or state jurisdiction, a question that remained unanswered until after the Civil War. This resulted in mixed signals and limited effectiveness of the 1846 treaty in ensuring peace. In 1847, Texas allowed German settlers in areas like Fredericksburg and New Braunfels to negotiate directly with the Comanches. Although an agreement was reached for land in exchange for a trading post and gifts, the Germans overstepped boundaries and were tardy with payments, prompting Comanche raids. A boundary was later defined by the Texas governor, but enforcement fell to the U.S. Army. which did not see itself as responsible for applying state agreements, further complicating interactions between settlers, the military, and the Comanches. Furthermore, not all Comanche bands had agreed to the treaty, and raids into Texas continued. The situation was equally tumultuous in other areas of Comancheria, especially with the onset of the Mexican War in 1846. American expansion and military movements, including the occupation of Santa Fe and the establishment of the Santa Fe Trail, led to increased conflict with Plains Indians. Quiet periods were rare and were soon disrupted, notably by the California Gold Rush starting in 1848, which caused a spike in horse raids by the Comanches, especially targeting northern Mexico. To address widespread conflict across the plains, the U.S. convened the Peace on the Plains Conference at Fort Laramie in 1851, seeking to delineate tribal territories to reduce intertribal conflicts. While many tribes signed the treaty, the Comanches and Kiowa, affected by a smallpox outbreak and distrust, did not participate initially. However, by 1853, with the tense gathering of thousands of Native Americans around Fort Atkinson, the U.S. negotiated a separate agreement with the Kiowa and Yamparica Comanches, promising annual payments in exchange for peace and safe passage. The Comanches and Kiowas had several reasons to be upset in 1852. They had been hit hard by outbreaks of smallpox and cholera. Their first encounter with smallpox back in 1780 to 1781 was so severe it led to the loss of entire Comanche groups. Another outbreak in 1816 to 1817 hit them again, and then the California Gold Rush brought smallpox in 1848 and cholera in 1849 to the Great Plains, affecting many tribes but particularly the Comanches and Kiowas. The government census showed that the Comanche population dropped from 20,000 in 1849 to just 12,000 by 1851, a blow from which they never fully recovered. Smallpox struck again in 1862 and cholera in 1867, reducing the Comanche population to less than 8,000 by 1870, with numbers still falling. Despite giving safe passage on the Santa Fe Trail, the Comanches were frustrated with ongoing problems in Texas. Settlers kept pushing into their lands, and the Texas Rangers were attacking them. The U.S. Army built a series of forts to keep the Comanches in check in Texas, eventually resorting to light cavalry regiments after initial forts with infantry could be bypassed by the Comanche. Adding to their grievances was the construction of forts like Fort Stockton, designed to disrupt the Great Comanche War Trail into northern Mexico. The U.S. was obligated under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to stop these raids into Mexico, which led to 366 claims from Mexico for Comanche and Apache raids between 1848 and 1853. Efforts to address the Texas Comanche problem weren't all military-focused. In 1854, the Texas legislature set aside 23,000 acres on the upper Brazos River for reservations for the Texas tribes. This effort included relocating some Penateca Comanche to these new reservations. Camp Cooper, commanded by Robert E. Lee in 1856, was constructed nearby. However, conflicts arose as local settlers accused the reservation tribes of stealing horses, leading to dangerous tensions. When the Army left Camp Cooper in 1858, the situation worsened. Texas pressured for more military action after discovering Kiowa and Comanche were raiding from sanctuaries in what is now Oklahoma. Between 1858 and 1860, the Army's light cavalry regiments were used against the Comanches in Oklahoma, including a notable attack by Colonel John Ford's Texas Rangers on a Comanche village on Little Robe Creek. This military offensive scattered the Comanches and Kiowas, leading them to move north and escalate attacks near the Santa Fe Trail. In response, the cavalry launched a punitive expedition in 1860, with Captain Samuel D. Sturgis making significant contact after an 8-day chase. In 1859, a conflict at the reservation was sparked by a settler mob attack, but the settlers were repelled. Facing hostility from local Texans, U.S. Indian Agent Robert Neighbors decided to shut the reservations and relocate their inhabitants to the Indian Territory. Tribes that hadn't been hostile to Texans, including the Tonkawa, Caddo, and Delaware, were forcibly moved. After settling his charges at the new Wichita Agency at Anadarko, Neighbors was ambushed and killed on his way back to Texas. When the Civil War broke out, Union troops left the area, making way for Confederate forces. Albert Pike, now in charge of Native American affairs for the Confederates, quickly made deals with the Comanches in August 1861, promising them all sorts of goods and services in exchange for peace. However, as the Confederacy was strapped for cash due to the war, they couldn't keep up their end of the bargain. With Texas needing to contribute soldiers to the fight against the Union, the federal forts that once kept the Comanche in check were left empty and eventually abandoned. This situation left the frontier unprotected, and feeling betrayed by the broken promises, the Comanche began pushing settlers back through raids, causing the Texas frontier to retreat significantly and also reigniting attacks in northern Mexico. The Civil War era also saw the Comanche pursuing a vendetta against the Tonkawa tribe, whom they despised for their previous collaboration with the Texas Rangers, including a particularly gruesome incident where a Comanche chief's brother was killed and eaten by the Tonkawa. This act of cannibalism was especially unforgivable to the Comanche. Meanwhile, when the Wichita Agency in Oklahoma came under Texas administration, the Comanche joined forces with pro-Union Native Americans to attack the agency in October 1862, leading to a tragic massacre of 300 Tonkawa. The survivors fled and would later become Army Scouts, using their position to seek vengeance against the Comanche. Post-1861, tribal groups, including the Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, nearly succeeded in shutting down the essential Santa Fe Trail. And upon learning of the Comanches' treaties with the Confederacy, Union officials assumed a hostile stance. The Union Army, stretched thin and filled out with men reluctant to serve, was unable to prevent these tribes from forming a formidable alliance that threatened significant disruption. In late 1864, Colonel Kit Carson attempted to punish the Comanche and Kiowa by raiding their camps. Despite being outnumbered, he managed to avoid a catastrophic defeat thanks to effective artillery use. This battle nearly became his last stand, but served as a stark reminder of the complex difficulties faced in the region. As the Civil War neared its end, the Confederacy tried one last time to rally the Plains tribes, holding a council in May 1865. However, the war's conclusion was already sealed with General Robert E. Lee's surrender weeks earlier, dashing any hopes of continued Confederate support or strategic advantage from these alliances. During that summer, while the Union was celebrating its victory, chaos unfolded across the plains. The Santa Fe and overland trails were shut down, and practically every tribe on the plains found themselves at odds with the United States. With federal soldiers taking back their positions in Texas, the Great Plains, and Indian Territory, government officials organized a meeting with the Plains tribes in October near Wichita, by the Little Arkansas River, aiming to negotiate peace. The peace treaty forged at Little Arkansas in 1865 handed over western Oklahoma and the entire Texas Panhandle to the Comanches and Kiowa, alongside a promise of $15 per person annually for 40 years. Among the Comanche divisions, the Yamparica, Noconi, Penateca, and Tenawa signed the treaty. However, the Quahada and Cotzoteca did not. The Kiowa Apache chose a different path, opting not to sign the Comanche-Kiowa Agreement and requesting inclusion under the terms of the Cheyenne-Arapaho Treaty. This was a clear sign of the prevailing instability. The arrival of the annuities brought widespread disappointment. The Comanches had expected firearms, ammunition, and quality goods, but instead they received spoiled Civil War rations and flimsy blankets that disintegrated in the rain. This breach of expectations led to the peace agreement being broken by both sides, plunging them back into war for another 2 years. It turned into a fierce conflict until General William Sherman took a firm stand, instructing the Army not to pay ransom for whites held captive by the Native Americans to discourage further kidnappings. As the military mapped out strategies to confront the hostiles, the government made one last attempt to reach a peaceful agreement. The significant peace conference at Medicine Lodge Creek in southern Kansas in October 1867 marked another effort to settle the conflict. In return for a convoy of gifts from the commissioners and the promise of annual annuities, the Comanches and Kiowa agreed to give up Comancheria for a reservation in southwestern Oklahoma spanning 3 million acres. The plan, however, did not go as hoped. Due to a cholera outbreak at their camps, the Quahada were absent from the conference and did not sign the treaty, which they later refused to acknowledge, choosing instead to remain on the Staked Plains. Many other Comanches relocated close to Fort Cobb for the winter, yet without the treaty's ratification, There was no funding for supplies, leading to a devastating winter of starvation. When summer came, the majority of the Comanches and Kiowa left Fort Cobb, returning to the plains where they conducted raids into Texas and Kansas. The new reservation served as a safe haven from Army pursuits, with even Fort Dodge coming under attack. Following the treaty's ratification in July, funds became accessible, but the responsibility for managing the annuities fell to the Army. All tribes were ordered to report to Fort Cobb or be labeled hostile. General Philip Sheridan activated plans for a winter offensive in 1868–69 against resistive groups in western Oklahoma and the Staked Plains. Major assaults were carried out by Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's 7th Cavalry and Major Andrew Evans, compelling most of the Comanches and other tribes to return to their agencies. In March 1869, the Comanche-Kiowa Agency was moved to Fort Sill, and the Cheyenne-Arapaho Agency to Darlington, with the Quahada remaining independent on the Staked Plains. Despite being on the reservation, the Kiowa, alongside other Comanches, still occasionally ventured out for raids in Texas. During one such raid near Jacksboro, in May 1871, they came perilously close to assassinating General William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman, who was inspecting western posts, narrowly avoided an ambush thanks to the Kiowa opting to attack a nearby supply train instead. Upon learning of this, Sherman was enraged and instructed the arrest and trial of the Kiowa chiefs in Texas, where they received life sentences. This sparked a series of retaliatory raids by the Comanches and Kiowa in 1872, even as Texas civilians stole horses from the tribes at Fort Sill. The Texas Army faced challenges with raids from the reservation and significant cattle thefts by the Quahada sold in New Mexico. In October 1871, a raid led by Quanah Parker resulted in the loss of 70 horses from the Army at Rock Station. Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie's response was relentless, as he and his troopers pursued the Quahada across the Staked Plains. Their campaign culminated in a decisive strike on a Comanche village at McClellan Creek in September 1872, taking 130 women and children hostage at Fort Conco, which led to a slowdown in raiding as negotiations for their release unfolded. By April 1873, the hostages were freed and escorted to Fort Sill, albeit with a detour around Jacksboro to avoid conflict. Thanks to the intervention of the Secretary of the Interior, Texas Governor Edmund J. Davis granted parole to the Kiowa chiefs in October after a shortened sentence, hoping to end the raiding. However, occasional strikes into Texas continued. Simultaneously, the Plains buffalo faced near extinction. From 1865 to 1875, the buffalo population on the Great Plains plummeted from 15 million to less than 1 million, largely due to hunting encouraged by Army commanders. The winter of 1873 to 74 saw Cheyenne hunters report back to the Darlington Agency about the decimation of southern buffalo herds by Kansas hunters. This news sparked violence at the Darlington and Wichita agencies, necessitating military intervention. As reports of the widespread killing of buffalo were confirmed, more Cheyenne, along with Comanches and Kiowa, left the reservations for the plains, marking another chapter in the troubled history between the Native American tribes and the United States government. Back in December, the United States government decided it was time to get tough with the Kiowa and Comanches in Texas due to their raids. The official in charge at Fort Sill cut off their food supplies and stopped giving them ammunition. This decision caused a lot of worry and fear, leading several groups of Comanches and Kiowa to leave their reservation by May. Initially, they weren't sure what their next move should be, especially since some Comanches had just been killed in Texas by Tonkawa scouts, stirring thoughts of revenge. But when the Fort Sill agent found out they were leaving, he quickly let the Army know. After a bit of discussing it, they settled on attacking buffalo hunters on the Staked Plains. In June 1874, a large group of Comanche and Cheyenne warriors launched an attack on 23 buffalo hunters at Adobe Walls in the Texas Panhandle, a site known for Carson's Battle in 1864. This event kicked off the Buffalo War, or Red River War, of 1874 to 1875, marking the last major Native American war in the Southern Plains. The initial attack didn't go as planned, and the Comanches were forced to pull back under the heavy fire from the hunters' powerful guns. The conflict quickly spread, with more fighters leaving their reservations to join the fight. Efforts to stop this included disarming those still at the reservations. One incident in August at the Wichita Agency escalated quickly when soldiers asked a group of Pentecost Comanches for their weapons, leading to a fight and a 2-day siege, only ending when reinforcements arrived from Fort Sill. By September, the majority of the Kiowa and Comanche were no longer on their reservations. Instead, they were out on the Staked Plains. That's when the Army made its move, with 3 groups moving into the heart of the plains. The Native American groups found themselves constantly on the move, trying to evade the Army. Colonel Nelson A. Miles's troops were the first to strike, defeating a group of Cheyenne. But a significant moment came when Mackenzie found and attacked a mixed camp in Palo Duro Canyon, capturing and killing a large number of horses and destroying supplies. Despite a few more encounters by fall and winter, the pressure and constant pursuit by U.S. troops took its toll. Hungry and without many options, the remaining Comanches, Kiowa, and Cheyenne started to return to their agencies, mostly on foot after being forced to eat their horses for survival. By December, around 900 were back at the Fort Sill Reservation. In April, the last of the Quahada Comanches who had held out surrendered at Fort Sill. By June, the last of them, including notable leaders Isatai and Quanah Parker, gave in. The war had ended. Mackenzie took many of their horses, distributing some to scouts and selling the rest, using the proceeds to buy sheep and goats for the Native Americans. By 1879, the buffalo that once roamed the plains in vast numbers were gone. In response, the government merged the Kiowa Comanche and Wichita agencies. Despite these drastic changes, the Comanches adapted. Quanah Parker, leveraging his background, emerged as a key leader. He made savvy moves like collecting tolls from cattle herds, crossing the reservation, and selling grazing rights. He lived in a large house known as the Star House for its decorated roof, and by the time he participated in Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in 1905, he had accumulated a considerable amount of wealth and land. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.